My grandfather left behind an estate worth $4,700,000. When the estate attorney read that staggering number aloud, the parents who had kicked me out of their house at 16 turned to me with greedy smiles. My mother patted my hand and promised they would manage my share to protect me from my own failures. They had absolutely no idea that the next page of the will was about to leave them with exactly $1 and make me their landlord. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members who thought they could walk all over you. I am Maya. I am 35 years old, and for the last 19 years I have been a ghost to my own family. Sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of my late grandfather Jeremiah's attorney, the silence felt heavy enough to crush bone. The air smelled of old paper leather polish and the overpowering floral perfume my mother Vivian always wore when she wanted to command a room. Across the wide oak desk sat the people who shared my blood but had never acted like my family. My mother, Vivian, and my father Desmond were dressed as if they were attending a coronation rather than a will reading. They were dripping in designer labels from my mother's ostentatious red-bottom heels to my father's flashy, oversized watch. They had spent their entire lives obsessed with status-climbing social ladders and projecting an image of flawless wealth. Beside them sat my younger sister Kiara. She was the golden child, the one who had been coddled, spoiled, and financially completely dependent on our parents for her entire life. Kiara was busy checking her reflection in her phone screen, looking bored but visibly eager for a payout. Next to Kiara sat her husband Connor. Connor was a white man who worked as a junior partner at a mid-sized corporate law firm in Atlanta. He had always carried himself with an insufferable arrogance, acting as though marrying into a successful African-American family gave him the right to dictate our dynamics. From the moment we all walked into the attorney office, Connor had been attempting to intimidate the seasoned estate lawyer. He casually dropped legal jargon into the conversation, leaning back in his chair with his legs crossed, trying to establish dominance in a room where he had absolutely no authority. It had been 19 years since I last spoke to my parents. 19 years since they packed my bags, locked me out in the pouring rain, and told me I was a selfish disappointment. Yet today, they were putting on a sickeningly sweet performance of family unity. When I first walked into the waiting room earlier that morning, Vivian had actually gasped, rushed over, and tried to pull me into a hug. She called me her prodigal daughter. Desmond had offered a stiff, rehearsed smile. They thought I was exactly the same broken 16-year-old girl they had thrown away. They looked at my tailored, understated coat and assumed I was still struggling, completely blind to the fact that the fabric alone cost more than their mortgage payment. As we waited for the attorney to organize his documents, Vivian and Desmond treated the solemn occasion like a victory lap. They did not even bother to lower their voices as they leaned their heads together loudly, whispering about the renovations they planned to make to Grandpa Jeremiah's sprawling estate. Vivian talked about knocking down the walls in the sunroom to create an open-concept entertainment space for her high society friends. Desmond nodded eagerly, adding that they should clear out Jeremiah's beloved classic car collection to make room for a home theater. They spoke about a great man's legacy, as if it were a clearance sale they had just won. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. In my line of work as a cybersecurity consultant, I am trained to observe, analyze threats, and wait for the right moment to strike. I watched them count their chickens before the eggs even hatched. I watched Connor tap his expensive pen against his knee, looking at me with thinly veiled pity. He leaned over to Kiara and whispered something that made her giggle. They were so utterly convinced of their own superiority. The estate attorney, a dignified older gentleman named Mr. Sterling, finally cleared his throat. He adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. The whispering immediately stopped. Vivian sat up perfectly straight, a hungry glint in her eyes. Desmond leaned forward, gripping the armrests of his leather chair. Kiara finally put her phone away. Mr. Sterling opened the heavy leather binder on his desk. He read the preliminary legal jargon, the standard declarations of sound mind and body, and the formal revocation of all prior wills. Then he took a breath and turned to the financial summary. I am authorized to disclose the total valuation of the assets belonging to the late Jeremiah Washington. Mr. Sterling said, his voice steady and calm in the quiet room, including liquid assets, investment portfolios, and the primary residential estate. The total value is $4,700,000. A collective gasp sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Kiara covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with undisguised greed. Desmond let out a low whistle, running a hand over his face as a massive, triumphant grin broke out across his features. Connor stopped tapping his pen. He sat up, his posture suddenly rigid, clearly doing the math in his head and calculating how much of that pie he could claim through his marriage to Kiara. Vivian did not gasp. Instead, a slow, deeply satisfied smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. She turned her head slowly to look at me. In her eyes, I saw decades of arrogance and control. She reached across the polished wood of the conference table and placed her manicured hand over mine, giving it a firm, condescending pat. "Do not worry, Maya," my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and toxic pity. "We know you have struggled out there in the world since you left us. $4 million is a lot for a family to handle, but your father and I have discussed it. We will put this in a family trust. We will manage your portion for you, so you do not have to stress about the financial burden. We will make sure you are taken care of." Connor immediately seized the opportunity to insert himself into the power dynamic. He pulled his chair closer to the table, clicking his pen with an obnoxious snap. He looked at me with the kind of mansplaining arrogance that made my blood boil. "Vivian is absolutely right," Maya Connor said, using his best lawyer voice. "A sudden influx of capital can be devastating to someone who does not have experience managing large-scale assets. I can draft the fiduciary protections and trust documents right now. We can set up a structured allowance for you. It is really just to keep you safe from yourself. We are family after all, and we want to protect you." They were trapping me in real time, or at least they thought they were. In their minds, they were already dividing up Grandpa Jeremiah's empire. They were planning to take my rightful inheritance, lock it behind a legal wall controlled by Connor, and hand me an allowance like a child. They wanted to exert the same financial and emotional control over me at 35 that they had wielded over me when I was a teenager. I did not pull my hand away from my mother. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the anger simmering just beneath my skin. I simply looked at Vivian, then looked at Connor, and offered a polite, totally empty smile. I turned my gaze back to Mr. Sterling. The elderly lawyer was watching the exchange with a completely unreadable expression, though I could see a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. He knew exactly what kind of people my parents were. Grandpa Jeremiah had made sure of that. I gave Mr. Sterling a single slight nod. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat again, drawing the greedy attention of my family back to the heavy binder on his desk. He turned the page. The crisp sound of the thick paper flipping over echoed loudly in the silent, tense room. The rustle of paper was the loudest sound in the world. Mr. Sterling looked over the rims of his glasses, his eyes briefly locking onto my mother before shifting down to the text. He cleared his throat one final time. "I have been instructed by the late Jeremiah Washington to read this final addendum exactly as written," Mr. Sterling announced. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the absolute devastation he was about to unleash. Vivian leaned forward, her red-bottom heels shifting on the plush carpet. She probably thought Grandpa had left her a special message of love. Desmond puffed out his chest, ready to receive his praise. "To my daughter, Vivian, and my son-in-law, Desmond." Mr. Sterling read, his voice ringing clearly in the quiet room. "You spent your lives chasing status while neglecting the true wealth of family. 19 years ago, you discarded my brilliant granddaughter, Maya. You locked a 16-year-old girl out in the rain because she refused to fund your reckless spending. For this unforgivable betrayal and for the hollow lives you have chosen to lead, I leave you exactly $1. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a bomb goes off before the shockwave hits. I watched my mother. The smug, condescending smile that had been plastered on her face just moments ago froze. The color rapidly drained from her perfectly contoured cheeks. She looked like all the air had been violently sucked from her lungs. Desmond gripped the armrests of his leather chair so hard his knuckles turned white. His mouth hung open but no sound came out. Connor frowned, his legal brain struggling to process the plain English he had just heard. "Wait $1," Connor asked, breaking the silence. "Each or collectively?" Mr. Sterling did not miss a beat. "Collectively, they are to split the $1." A strangled, high-pitched noise escaped my mother's throat. It was not quite a gasp and not quite a scream. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire identity disintegrate. "That is a mistake," Vivian finally managed to choke out. Her hands were shaking violently as she pressed them flat against the mahogany table. "My father would never write that. He loved me. I am his only daughter. This document is a fake. I can assure you, Mrs. Washington, this document is entirely authentic," Mr. Sterling replied calmly. "I drafted it myself under your father's direct supervision. He was of exceptionally sound mind." "Read the rest of it," I said. My voice was smooth, quiet, and completely steady. Vivian snapped her head toward me, her eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. "Yes, the addendum continues," Mr. Sterling said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Furthermore, the deed to the primary estate located in Buckhead, the property you currently reside in, is hereby transferred in its entirety to Maya. She has sole ownership and total discretion over your immediate eviction." If the first part of the addendum was a bomb, the second part was total nuclear fallout. "No!" Vivian shrieked. She shot out of her chair, her designer purse clattering to the floor. "That is my house. I picked out the drapes. I hosted the charity league there. He cannot give my house to her." "It was never your house, Vivian," Mr. Sterling corrected gently but firmly. "It belonged to the trust, and the trust has now transferred the deed to Maya." Desmond turned a bright, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk tie. "Let me see that signature right now," he demanded, slamming his fist onto the desk. He had to be out of his mind. He had dementia. He was crazy. "I want to see the ink." "Your father-in-law passed a comprehensive cognitive evaluation. The very morning he signed this document," Mr. Sterling countered, pushing a certified medical record across the desk. "We anticipated this exact reaction. You have absolutely no grounds to contest his mental capacity." Connor sprang into action, desperate to save the fortune he thought he had married into. He jumped up from his chair, his face twisted in arrogant fury. "This is highly irregular," Connor barked, pointing a finger at the elderly attorney. "You are acting in bad faith. I will have this entire estate frozen in probate by tomorrow morning. I am a partner at a corporate firm, and I will bury you in litigation. I will sue this office, I will sue the estate, and I will sue Maya for undue influence." I sat perfectly still, letting his tantrum wash over me. Connor was barking loud because he had no bite. He was a junior partner at best, trying to throw around weight he did not possess. "You are welcome to file whatever frivolous motions you please, Connor," Mr. Sterling said, entirely unbothered. "But as the document states, the transfer of the deed was completed prior to his death through a living trust. Maya already owns the house. The transaction is done. There is nothing for you to freeze." Kiara, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally realized what this meant for her. Her limitless credit cards, her luxury shopping sprees, her entire lifestyle funded by my parents, living in our grandfather's house. It was all gone. "Mom, do something." Kiara whined, her voice pitching into a panicked cry. "Where are we going to live? What about my car payments?" "Connor, fix this." "I am trying to fix it," Connor snapped at his wife. The facade of their perfect marriage cracking under the sudden financial pressure. Vivian looked like she was going to be sick. She turned to me, her eyes wild, the toxic pity from earlier completely replaced by raw desperation. The condescending mother playing the savior was dead. Now she was just a woman terrified of losing her social status. "Maya," Vivian pleaded, reaching across the table again. This time I pulled my hand away before she could touch me. "Maya, please. You have to understand. Your grandfather was old and confused. You cannot possibly accept this. We are your family. We took care of you. You threw me out in the rain because I would not give you my minimum wage paycheck to pay off Kiara's car," I stated plainly. The absolute truth hung in the air, cold and undeniable. "You told me I was useless. You told me I would never amount to anything. You told me to never come back. You were a difficult teenager," Desmond yelled, pointing an accusing finger at me. You were stubborn and disrespectful. We did what we had to do to teach you a lesson. And now I am teaching you one, I replied. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored coat, letting my hands rest briefly on the luxurious fabric. I made sure they saw the custom stitching, the elegant cut, the undeniable proof of a wealth they could not comprehend. I did not look like a struggling dropout. I looked like the boss I was. I looked at my mother, whose face was stained with mascara tears. I looked at my father, who was breathing heavily in defeated rage. I looked at Kiara sobbing into her hands, and Connor frantically scrolling through his phone, looking for legal loopholes that did not exist. You wanted to manage my life, I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of their panic. You wanted to put me on an allowance. You wanted to protect me from myself. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a single finger, silencing her instantly. You currently reside in my house, I announced, savoring the taste of every single syllable. You have 30 days to pack your designer clothes and vacate my property. If you leave so much as a scratch on the hardwood floors, I will deduct the repair costs from your $1 inheritance. You cannot do this to us, Vivian wailed, burying her face in Desmond's shoulder. We have nowhere to go. All our friends live in that neighborhood. What will people say? They will probably say you should have planned better, I offered cheerfully. I turned to Mr. Sterling, who was calmly organizing his files. Thank you for your time today, Mr. Sterling. I will be in touch regarding the execution of the remaining assets. It is my pleasure, Maya, the attorney replied, giving me a respectful nod. Your grandfather would be very proud of how you handled yourself today. I did not spare my family another glance. I did not need to see their tears or hear their excuses. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the office. Behind me, the room dissolved into absolute chaos. I could hear Connor yelling at Desmond about financial liabilities. I could hear Kiara sobbing about how unfair her life was. I could hear my mother screaming my name, begging me to come back and negotiate. I pushed the office doors open and stepped out into the hallway. The thick wood swung shut behind me, instantly muffling the sounds of their complete and utter destruction. I took a deep breath of the cool, conditioned air. My heart was beating steadily. My hands were not shaking. I felt a profound, incredible sense of peace. I walked down the long corridor toward the elevators, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Every step felt like shedding a physical weight. For 19 years I had carried the heavy burden of their rejection. I had let their cruel words echo in the back of my mind, while I worked late nights, built my business, and secured my future. I had spent nearly 2 decades proving to myself that I was not the worthless girl they threw away. But today, I did not just prove it to myself. Today, the universe delivered the ultimate receipt. My grandfather had seen them exactly for who they were: greedy, empty, and cruel. And he had seen me for exactly who I am. I reached the elevator bank and pressed the button for the lobby. The digital numbers above the doors counted down, chiming softly as the metal doors slid open. I stepped inside the empty car and turned around, watching the reflection of the polished lobby in the mirrored walls. The trap had sprung perfectly. They walked in expecting to feast on my grandfather's legacy and treat me like a helpless child. Instead, they walked out, bankrupt, humiliated, and entirely at my mercy. But I knew this was not the end of the war. Vivian and Desmond were obsessed with their image, and Connor was obsessed with his ego. They would not surrender a multi-million-dollar estate without trying to drag me down with them. As the elevator descended toward the ground floor, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I had a lot of work to do and exactly 30 days to watch them squirm. The lobby of the law building was bright and echoing with the sound of busy professionals. I strode past the reception desk without a backward glance and pushed through the revolving glass doors into the crisp Atlanta afternoon. My private driver, David, was already waiting at the curb. He stepped out immediately, opening the rear door of my armored black SUV. I slid into the plush leather interior, the heavy door shutting behind me with a solid, satisfying thud that blocked out the noise of the city. Before David even pulled the vehicle away from the curb, my phone began to vibrate violently against my palm. The screen lit up with a rapid-fire succession of text messages. They were from Kiara. "How could you do this to us?" my sister texted. We are your family. Connor says you are going to jail for fraud. You better answer the phone right now. You are a monster. I swiped the notifications away, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. Then the calls started. First came a barrage of blocked numbers, which I knew instantly were Vivian and Desmond trying to bypass my phone settings. They were scrambling, desperate to regain the upper hand, trying to scream at me through the phone because their physical threats no longer held any power. I ignored the calls and dialed my head of security at the firm. Tyson answered on the first ring. Lock down the perimeter. I instructed, my voice crisp and authoritative. I want Vivian, Desmond, Kiara, and Connor flagged in the system immediately. Distribute their photos to all lobby personnel and the parking garage attendants. If their vehicles come anywhere near our corporate headquarters, I want them denied entry and escorted off the premises by armed guards. Do not engage in conversation with them, just remove them. Tyson confirmed the orders without hesitation. I ended the call and dialed my business partner. Chloe picked up immediately. Tell me the building is still standing, Chloe said, a knowing smirk audible in her voice. The building is fine. Fine, I replied, watching the city skyline roll past the tinted windows. But my parents are currently hyperventilating in an estate lawyer's office. The bomb dropped perfectly. They have 30 days to pack up their designer bags and vacate my property. Chloe let out a sharp laugh. I wish I could have seen Connor's face. Did the hotshot lawyer try to threaten you? Of course he did, I said. He threw a tantrum and promised to bury me in litigation. He has no idea who he is dealing with yet. They really thought you were still that scared teenager. Chloe noted, her tone shifting to something more protective. They really thought you had been rotting in the gutter all these years. They believed what they wanted to believe, I said quietly, looking out the window. My mind drifted away from the luxury of my current life and slammed right back into the memory of the night they threw me away. 19 years is a long time, but the sting of that particular betrayal had been carved into my bones. I was 16 years old. I had been working 30 hours a week at a local tech repair shop after school, fixing motherboards and recovering lost data for neighborhood customers. I was saving every single dime I earned. I had a hidden shoebox in my closet where I kept my bank statements tracking my progress toward my college tuition. I was brilliant with computers, and I knew education was my only ticket out of their toxic household. But Vivian and Desmond had other plans. They were drowning in secret credit card debt, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of wealth to impress their country club friends. Kiara was turning 16, and they had promised her a brand new luxury convertible for her birthday. I came home from a brutal closing shift at the repair shop to find my bedroom door hanging wide open. My shoebox was overturned on the mattress. The bank statements were gone. I ran downstairs and found Vivian and Desmond sitting at the kitchen table, casually reviewing my routing numbers. When I demanded to know what they were doing, Vivian did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She told me they were transferring my college fund to cover the down payment on Kiara's vehicle. She said it was a family contribution, that Kiara needed to look successful for her social circle, and that I was being selfish for hoarding money while the family needed it. I fought back. I told them I would call the police. I told them I would report them for theft. Desmond stood up, his face twisted in rage, and demanded I hand over the rest of my uncashed paychecks to cover his country club dues. When I refused, they did not just punish me, they erased me. Desmond grabbed me by the collar of my jacket and dragged me to the front door. Vivian followed close behind, carrying a black garbage bag stuffed with a random assortment of my clothes. She threw the bag out onto the porch. It was pouring rain that night, the kind of heavy, freezing downpour that chills you to your core. Desmond shoved me out into the storm. "You are a selfish disappointment," he yelled, his voice cutting through the thunder. "You are a parasite. Do not ever come back to this house." The heavy oak door slammed shut. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. I stood there shivering on the porch, watching the water soak through my meager belongings, realizing that the people who were supposed to protect me had just sacrificed me to save their own vanity. I survived. I took my remaining cash, found a cheap room to rent with other students, and threw myself into my education. I clawed my way through a grueling degree program on full academic scholarships. I worked tirelessly in the cybersecurity sector, identifying vulnerabilities and building defense systems. I partnered with Chloe, and together we built a firm that catered to the top corporate players in the country. I became wealthy, independent, and untouchable. And through all of it, I let Vivian and Desmond believe their own lies. They told the extended family that I was a runaway, a high school dropout, who got mixed up with the wrong crowd. They spun a tragic tale to garner sympathy at their dinner parties, acting like devastated parents while they lived off the money they stole from my future. I never corrected the rumors. I preferred being a ghost to them. It kept them away from my growing empire. But I was not a ghost to everyone. So what is the next move? Chloe asked, pulling me back to the present moment. Connor is going to try to hit you with a lawsuit by tomorrow morning. Are we preparing the legal team? Let him try, I said, a genuine smile touching my lips. He is walking blindly into a minefield. Grandpa Jeremiah made sure of that. The mention of my grandfather sent a wave of warmth through my chest. Vivian and Desmond truly believed Jeremiah was just an old, confused man fading away in his mansion. They had no idea that 2 years ago Jeremiah had hired a private investigator to track down his missing granddaughter. The investigator found me in a corner office of a high-rise building running a multi-million-dollar tech security firm. I will never forget the day Jeremiah walked into my office. He was already getting sick, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, but his eyes were sharper than ever. He sat across from my desk, looked at the awards on my wall, and wept. He did not cry out of sadness. He cried out of sheer, overwhelming pride. We secretly reconnected. We spent hours drinking coffee in my secure boardroom, completely hidden from Vivian and Desmond's watchful eyes. I told him the truth about the night I was kicked out. I told him about the stolen college fund, the rain, the deadbolt. Jeremiah was furious, but he was a businessman first. He did not confront them. He knew an emotional confrontation would just give them time to hide their assets and manipulate the narrative. Instead, Jeremiah and I plotted. He saw the woman I had actually become. He recognized my strategic mind and my refusal to back down. He realized his daughter Vivian was a parasite who had spent her entire adult life feeding off his hard work while destroying her own child. We brought in Mr. Sterling and quietly restructured the entire estate. We placed the primary residence in a living trust and legally transferred the deed to my name, ensuring it would never even enter the probate process. We laid the trap perfectly, leaving Vivian and Desmond with a false sense of security right up until the jaws snapped shut around them. I am pulling up to the headquarters now, I told Chloe, watching the towering glass structure of our corporate building come into view. Get the forensic accounting team ready. We are going to need the audit files organized by the end of the day. Consider it done, Chloe said. See you upstairs. I ended the call and slipped my phone into my pocket. The black SUV glided smoothly into the private underground parking garage. David opened my door, and I stepped out into the bright fluorescent lighting of my domain. My parents thought they could throw me away like trash. They thought they could strip me of my resources, lock me out of my own home, and leave me to drown in the storm. But they failed. The rain had not washed me away. It had simply washed off the illusion that I needed them. I walked toward the private elevator that led directly to my executive suite. I had a multi-million-dollar firm to run, an estate to manage, and a brother-in-law to destroy. The war had just begun, but I was already holding all the winning cards. The private elevator opened with a soft chime, revealing the penthouse level of my corporate headquarters. I stepped out onto the polished concrete floors of the main operations hub. The air hummed with the quiet intensity of dozens of top-tier analysts and engineers, monitoring digital threat matrices across massive screens spanning the entire length of the room. This was the fortress I had built entirely with my own 2 hands. I did not inherit a single brick of this establishment. I did not rely on family connections, generational wealth, or elite networking groups to get my foot in the door. I clawed my way out of the rain-soaked porch of my youth, using nothing but academic scholarships, relentless coding, and an absolute refusal to be defeated by the people who brought me into this world. I pushed open the heavy glass door to my private office. Chloe was already there, sitting at the massive marble conference table with her laptop open and several high-security encrypted drives laid out in front of her. Chloe was not just my business partner, she was the sister I actually chose. A brilliant forensic accountant and security architect who knew every single detail of my past. She was the one who helped me build the company from the ground up, and she despised my biological family almost as much as I did. She handed me a cup of black coffee as I took my seat at the head of the long table. "We need to move faster than Connor," I said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee and letting the caffeine sharpen my focus. He is extremely arrogant, but he is still a corporate lawyer with access to significant resources. The sheer humiliation he suffered in that office today is going to fester and rot his ego. He will go back to his firm, rally whatever favors he can borrow from senior partners, and attempt to launch a massive legal assault against the estate. He will try to freeze the liquid assets, claim undue influence, or argue that Grandpa Jeremiah was not of sound mind when he drafted the final addendum. Chloe typed rapidly on her mechanical keyboard, bringing up the secure legal portals we regularly used for our own corporate audits. "He has zero legitimate grounds." She pointed out, her eyes scanning the scrolling text on her monitor. "The attorney documented the medical evaluations perfectly. The living trust bypasses the probate court system completely. Connor cannot legally freeze a house you already own, and he cannot block the transfer of the deed. It is a done deal. He cannot win." I agreed, setting my coffee cup down on the marble surface. "But he will try to tie up the remaining liquid assets, just to bleed me dry with exorbitant legal fees. He thinks I am a vulnerable target, who will eventually fold under the pressure of corporate litigation. He thinks I will hand over a settlement just to make the headache go away. What Connor does not understand is that he just declared war on a woman who dismantles hostile takeovers for a living. I is playing checkers while we own the entire board." As the newly appointed executor of Jeremiah's estate, I had full, uncontested legal authorization to access every single financial record, bank statement, investment portfolio, and tax return my grandfather had filed over the last decade. I logged into my secure terminal, my fingers flying across the keys, as I synced my credentials with the estate accounts that had been seamlessly transferred to my control just an hour ago. "Pull everything," I instructed Chloe. My eyes locked on the initial readouts illuminating my monitor. "I want a complete granular history of Grandpa Jeremiah's finances. I want to see every wire transfer, every credit card statement, every medical bill, every charitable donation, and every property tax record. I want the timeline to begin from the exact moment Vivian acquired his medical power of attorney 5 years ago until the day he took his final breath. Leave no stone unturned." We sat in the quiet, focused hum of my office as the massive data files began to download and decrypt through our secure servers. I knew Vivian and Desmond better than anyone else in the world. I knew their insatiable appetite for luxury, their desperate need to appear wealthy to their peers, and their absolute lack of moral boundaries. If they were willing to steal a 16-year-old girl's hard-earned college fund just to buy a shiny convertible for their golden child, there was absolutely no limit to what they might have done when given unfettered access to an elderly man's multi-million-dollar fortune. Connor and Kiara were likely sitting in their expensive, heavily mortgaged townhome right now, frantically strategizing their next move. They were probably drafting threatening letters and calculating how much money they could extort from me to keep my name clean. They were completely unaware that I was not just building a legal defense. I was building a weapon of mass destruction. I watched the green progress bars on my screen inch closer and closer toward 100%, feeling the familiar icy focus that always settled over me during a major security breach. My pulse was steady, my mind sharp and unclouded by the emotional baggage they had tried to saddle me with today. They thought they could bully me into submission with loud voices and legal threats. They thought I would cower the way I did when I was a teenager facing the freezing rain. My family wanted a legal battle to protect their stolen lifestyle. I was going to give them a forensic slaughter that would leave them with absolutely nothing. The downloads completed with a soft chime and millions of rows of financial data populated my screen. Chloe pulled up the first batch of transaction logs on her secondary monitor. "The sheer volume of expenditures is staggering," she noted, highlighting a column of outgoing wire transfers that instantly looked suspicious. "It looks like they treated his primary checking account like a personal slush fund. There are withdrawals here that do not align with any standard geriatric care costs. Let the data tell the story. I replied, initiating an automated sorting algorithm designed to flag large irregular sums. We are not just looking for missing money. We are looking for the exact mechanism of their greed. We need to map out every vacation, every designer purchase, and every lifestyle upgrade they flaunted over the last half-decade. We are going to build a timeline so airtight that no lawyer in the country will be able to defend them. The room fell silent again, save for the rhythmic clicking of our keyboards. I was no longer the discarded daughter, mourning the loss of a family that never loved her. I was the architect of their downfall, methodically examining the digital footprints they were too arrogant to conceal. They had spent 19 years building a fragile house of cards entirely dependent on my silence and my supposed failure. Now I held the match, and I was going to enjoy watching the entire structure burn to the ground. 3 days had passed since the explosive reading of my grandfather's will. For 72 straight hours, my business partner, Chloe, and I had been locked inside my executive suite, running relentless forensic audits on Jeremiah's estate. The financial records were a goldmine of absolute corruption, revealing exactly how my parents had been siphoning my grandfather's money for years. The sheer volume of their theft was staggering, but the intense screen time had left my eyes burning. I needed a brief change of scenery before finalizing our counteroffensive. I left my secure corporate building and walked down the block to an exclusive artisan coffee roaster. It was a sleek, minimalist space filled with quiet tech developers and finance executives conducting hushed meetings. I ordered my usual black espresso and took a seat in a discreet leather booth facing the street. I was looking forward to exactly 10 minutes of unbroken silence. I did not even get the chance to take my first sip before the atmosphere in the shop violently shifted. The heavy glass door swung open, and my sister Kiara marched inside. Her husband Connor followed closely behind her. They looked entirely out of place among the understated professionals. Kiara was wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, scanning the room with a frantic, nervous energy. Connor marched 2 steps ahead of her, gripping a thick manila folder in his right hand, like it was a loaded weapon. They had obviously staked out my building, waiting for me to step outside the impenetrable perimeter of my corporate security team. They spotted me sitting in the corner booth. Connor did not hesitate. He marched straight over to my table and slammed his hands down on the surface, causing my espresso cup to rattle loudly against its ceramic saucer. He did not bother with a greeting. He simply threw the manila folder across the smooth wooden table. It skidded and stopped exactly an inch from my coffee. I leaned back into the plush leather upholstery, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. I did not flinch. I did not look at the folder. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Connor. His face was flushed with manufactured authority and unearned confidence. Kiara slid into the booth opposite me, pulling off her sunglasses to reveal eyes she had clearly forced to look red and puffy for dramatic effect. "Maya, we are going to make this very simple for you," Connor announced, his voice booming much too loud for the quiet coffee shop. Several patrons at nearby tables turned to stare, but Connor ignored them entirely. He unbuttoned his expensive suit jacket with a smug, arrogant flick of his wrist, standing tall to try and use his physical height to intimidate me. "I am stepping in to handle this absolute mess you created before you destroy this family permanently. I have drawn up a comprehensive settlement agreement to fix your mistake." I raised a single eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. I wanted him to speak. I wanted him to empty his entire arsenal right here in public, so I could measure exactly how foolish he truly was. Connor took my calm silence as submission. A triumphant smirk crept across his face as he launched into a deeply condescending lecture, breaking down basic legal concepts as if he were explaining the rules of a board game to a slow child. "Listen carefully, Maya, because probate law is incredibly complex, and I do not want you to get confused by big words," Connor said, leaning closer over the table. "When an elderly person with declining health makes sudden drastic changes to their estate plan, it creates an immediate legal presumption of undue influence. You isolated a vulnerable old man. You manipulated a dying grandfather into signing a legal document he clearly did not understand. If we take this to court, A judge will freeze every single asset immediately. You will be tied up in brutal litigation for the next decade. The legal fees alone will bankrupt you before you even see the inside of a courtroom. I watched his mouth move, marveling at his absolute confidence in his own superiority. He was throwing around phrases like undue influence and probate freezes without knowing the first thing about the ironclad living trust my grandfather and I had established. Connor was banking entirely on my supposed ignorance. He expected me to be intimidated by his expensive suit and his loud, aggressive posturing. I thought that because I was a black woman who had been estranged from her wealthy family, I would automatically assume he possessed a superior understanding of the legal system. He was attempting to weaponize his privilege to steal my legacy, and he was doing it with a smile on his face. He tapped his silver pen aggressively against the manila folder. But Vivian and Desmond are generous, forgiving people. Connor continued, his tone dripping with fake magnanimity. They do not want to see you dragged through a humiliating public trial. They do not want to completely destroy your life again, just when you might be getting back on your feet. So I have drafted a highly favorable compromise on their behalf. You sign over $4 million of the liquid assets back to your parents where the money rightfully belongs. You also sign a quitclaim deed transferring the primary residence back to them today. In exchange, you get to walk away with $700,000 clear and free. We will not file the lawsuit and you avoid the embarrassment of a public legal slaughter. I simply stared at him. The sheer audacity of this mediocre white man standing in my city trying to bully a self-made millionaire out of her rightful inheritance, using entirely baseless legal threats, was genuinely comical. He truly believed I was an uneducated runaway who would tremble at the mere threat of litigation. He did not know that my cybersecurity company routinely audited international corporate law firms exactly like the one that employed him. He did not know I had spent the last 3 days tracing the exact routing numbers where my parents had stolen money to pay for the very suit he was currently wearing. Before I could even formulate a response to Connor's ridiculous ultimatum, Kiara leaned across the table and inserted herself into the performance. Her lower lip was trembling violently. She reached out across the wood grain and tried to grab my hand, but I smoothly pulled my arm back, letting her manicured fingers grasp empty air. "Maya, please, just sign the papers," Kiara begged, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing to Mom and Dad right now. You are physically destroying them. Mom has not stopped crying for 3 straight days. She cannot eat and she cannot sleep. Dad is having terrible chest pains and his blood pressure is dangerously high. They had to call a private doctor to the house yesterday because Dad thought he was having a heart attack, all because of the stress you caused." Kiara was weaponizing her tears just like our mother had taught her. She was trying to paint me as the villain who was tearing a loving family apart, when in reality they had torn me away from them 19 years ago without a second thought. She expected me to prioritize Desmond's supposedly high blood pressure over my own survival. She expected me to care about her childhood memories in a house that was paid for by the grandfather they were actively stealing from. Her entitlement was staggering. She truly believed that my entire existence should be sacrificed to maintain her comfort and luxury. Kiara let a single dramatic tear roll down her cheek, wiping it away with a trembling hand. "They took care of us, Maya. They gave us everything we ever wanted, and you come back into our lives after 19 years just to ruin the family peace. You owe them this money. You owe them the house. It is the home I grew up in. It is where all my childhood memories are. How can you be so incredibly cruel as to throw your own parents out on the street over some petty grudge from when we were teenagers?" She pointed at the manila folder, her voice rising in pitch. "Just take the $700,000, Maya. It is more money than you have ever seen in your entire life. You can finally get a real apartment and fix your broken life. You can start over somewhere else. Please stop being so selfish and just sign the folder so we can all go back to normal." I sat in the booth, letting the silence stretch out between us. The ambient noise of the coffee shop faded into the background as I processed the absolute delusion radiating from my sister and her husband. They were trying to manipulate me with guilt, using the health of the parents who had literally locked me out in a freezing rainstorm to fend for myself. They were offering me a fraction of my own grandfather's estate and presenting it as a charitable donation to a poor, struggling relative. They thought they held all the power because they had a manila folder and a loud voice. They had no idea that I held the keys to their entire destruction and I was about to lock the doors. I let the silence stretch out across the table. I sat perfectly still in the leather booth of the coffee shop, allowing Kiara's fake theatrical tears to dry up in the cold reality of my complete indifference. Connor sat beside her, still tapping his expensive silver pen against the manila folder, waiting for me to break. He expected me to be intimidated. He expected me to tremble under the weight of his unearned authority and the heavy-handed legal threats he had just thrown in my face. I truly believed he had painted me into a corner. I looked at the flimsy manila folder sitting an inch from my coffee cup. I slowly reached out with my right hand and pushed it back across the smooth wooden table, using only my index finger. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout or match his aggressive, frantic energy to establish dominance. True power is perfectly quiet, and I was holding all of it. Connor, I began, letting his name sit in the air like a sharp reprimand. Your grasp of state probate law is genuinely embarrassing for someone claiming to be a corporate attorney. You are sitting here aggressively attempting to leverage a presumption of undue influence based on a standard testamentary shift. But you failed to do even the most basic preliminary research before trying to ambush me today. Grandpa Jeremiah did not simply execute a new will last week and leave it vulnerable to a probate freeze. He legally funded a comprehensive revocable living trust 2 years ago. The assets you are threatening to freeze bypassed the probate court system entirely the exact second he took his final breath. Connor stopped tapping his pen. His arrogant smirk faltered slightly, but he tried to maintain his rigid posture. I kept my voice smooth, clinical, and absolutely lethal. Furthermore, I continued leaning slightly forward so he could hear every single syllable clearly. Under the revised state trust code, successfully challenging the capacity of a grantor requires irrefutable medical evidence of severe cognitive decline at the exact moment the documents were executed. You just threatened to freeze assets that have already been legally transferred, vested, and fully insured. We secured verified, notarized medical evaluations from 2 independent board-certified neurologists on the very morning Grandpa Jeremiah signed the final addendum. A judge would throw out your desperate injunction before his lunch break, and you would be formally sanctioned by the court for filing a frivolous, malicious motion. The color began to drain from Connor's face. He opened his mouth to argue, his legal brain scrambling to formulate a defense, but I did not give him the oxygen. You sat down at this table and offered me $700,000 of my own money, like you were handing a beggar a winning lottery ticket. I stated, my eyes locking dead onto his. You thought you could blindside a vulnerable woman, but you walked into a trap of your own making. I reached down into my tailored designer tote bag and pulled out a sleek, heavy black leather folder. I dropped it squarely onto the center of the table. It landed with a solid thud that made Kiara flinch. Open it, I commanded. Connor hesitated. The arrogant corporate shark from 5 minutes ago was rapidly shrinking into a terrified associate. He reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the black leather cover. Inside sat a thick, glossy, highly classified document bearing the unmistakable logo of his exact law firm. Stamped across the top in bold red ink were the words Comprehensive Cybersecurity Audit and Penetration Test Results. Connor stared at the document, his eyes darting frantically across the executive summary. He looked up at me, genuine confusion and rising panic written all over his pale face. My company is Vanguard Cyber Defense, I explained calmly, watching the realization strike him like a physical blow. You thought I was a high school dropout rotting in a gutter because you believed the pathetic lies Vivian and Desmond spun to cover up their own financial crimes. The reality is that I am the founder and chief executive officer of a top-tier tech security firm. Last month, the senior managing partners of your law firm, Richard Caldwell and Harrison Pierce, personally hired Vanguard on a multi-million-dollar annual retainer to overhaul your entire digital infrastructure. Connor stopped breathing. He looked down at the document again, seeing his boss's direct signatures on the service agreement printed on the second page. We ran a massive granular audit on your firm. I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. My engineering team exposed critical vulnerabilities in your secure client portals. We patched breaches in your internal communications network. I spent 3 hours in a private boardroom last Thursday briefing Caldwell and Pierce on how easily a hostile entity could dismantle your firm's reputation. I have both of your managing partners on my personal speed dial. The $700,000 you just tried to offer me as a settlement is less than what I charge your law firm for a standard quarterly retainer. Kiara sat frozen in the booth. Her fake tears had completely vanished. She looked back and forth between me and her husband, desperately waiting for Connor to say something clever to shut me down to prove that he was still the smartest man in the room. But Connor could not speak. The crushing weight of his colossal miscalculation was paralyzing him. I leaned closer, ensuring there was absolutely no misunderstanding about what was going to happen next. Let me explain the concept of a professional conflict of interest to you, Connor, I said, delivering the final devastating blow. You are a highly replaceable junior attorney at a firm that is currently paying me millions of dollars to keep their sensitive data from leaking onto the dark web. If you attempt to file a baseless fraudulent lawsuit against me on behalf of Vivian and Desmond, you will force your firm into a massive ethical and financial conflict. Do you honestly believe Caldwell and Pierce will jeopardize their elite cybersecurity infrastructure to support a junior partner's personal family vendetta? Connor swallowed hard. His face was now the color of chalk. His expensive suit suddenly looked like it was swallowing him whole. They will not support you, I answered for him. If you file that paperwork, they will fire you by 5 o'clock today. You will be stripped of your position, your salary, and your reputation to protect my corporate contract. You will lose your career trying to steal my house. The silence in the coffee shop felt absolute. I had dismantled his entire existence in less than 5 minutes. He had tried to weaponize his privilege against me, assuming my race, my gender, and the false rumors of my poverty made me an easy target. Instead, he had run headfirst into a brick wall of black excellence and corporate dominance. Kiara finally broke the silence. The reality that her luxurious lifestyle was truly gone, that her husband was entirely powerless, and that I was completely untouchable, finally shattered her fragile mind. "You cannot do this," Kiara screamed, her voice cracking as she lost all control. "You are ruining my life. You are ruining everything." She grabbed her large iced latte from the table and hurled it directly at my face. I did not panic. I simply leaned my upper body to the left with smooth, practiced calm. The heavy plastic cup sailed past my shoulder and smashed violently against the leather upholstery of the booth behind me. Ice cubes and cold milk exploded across the seat, dripping down the wall in a messy, pathetic display of her complete emotional failure. Several customers gasped. A barista rushed out from behind the counter looking horrified at the mess Kiara had just created. Connor grabbed Kiara by the arm, dragging her back down into the booth as she continued to sob and shake hysterically. He looked terrified that someone was going to call the police. I did not look back at the spilled coffee. I calmly picked up my sleek black leather folder and slipped it back into my designer tote bag. I stood up from the table, smoothing the wrinkles from my tailored trousers. I looked down at Connor, who was frantically trying to quiet his hysterical wife while avoiding the staring eyes of every single person in the coffee shop. "I suggest you spend your afternoon updating your resume instead of drafting frivolous lawsuits," I told him, "and remind Vivian and Desmond that the clock is ticking. They have 27 days left to vacate my property." I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and dropped it right on top of Connor's pathetic manila folder to cover the cost of my espresso. I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped out into the bright, warm Atlanta sunshine. I did not look back. I left them sitting in a puddle of spilled milk and shattered egos, completely trapped in the humiliating mess they had made, with absolutely no one to pay the bill but themselves. The warm Atlanta sun on my face felt like a victory lap as I walked away from the coffee shop. I stepped back into the sleek interior of my waiting vehicle and instructed David to take me straight to the office. The petty skirmish with Connor and Kiara was over. They were a distraction, a noisy nuisance that I had swatted away with minimal effort. Now it was time to execute the real war strategy. Grandpa Jeremiah had entrusted me with his legacy, and I was going to dismantle the parasites who had infected his final years. By the time I reached my corporate headquarters, the official documents from Mr. Sterling had been processed and securely filed. I was now the sole uncontested executor of Jeremiah Washington's estate. The legal weight of that title gave me absolute unrestricted access to every financial footprint my grandfather had left behind. More importantly, it gave me the legal authority to scrutinize every single decision my mother had made while she held his medical and financial power of attorney. I walked directly into the secure data center on our penthouse floor. Chloe had already assembled our top 3 forensic accounting specialists. The room was illuminated by the cool blue glow of massive monitors displaying decades of my grandfather's financial history. I took my place at the head of the long glass table. We were not looking at a standard portfolio. Grandpa Jeremiah had built a logistics and shipping empire from the ground up. His assets were complex, diversified, and highly lucrative, but my focus was narrow. I told my team to isolate the data from exactly 5 years ago. 5 years ago was the turning point. That was the year Grandpa Jeremiah suffered his first major stroke. It was the year his iron grip on his own life began to slip, and the exact moment Vivian swooped in like a vulture. She had petitioned for and secured full power of attorney, claiming she wanted to manage his care and relieve him of his financial burdens. She painted herself as the devoted daughter stepping up to the plate. I knew better. I told Chloe to run a comparative analysis between the estate's outgoing cash flow and Vivian's personal banking records. The algorithms began to sort through the noise, matching dates, amounts, and routing numbers. What we uncovered over the next 6 hours was a layer of betrayal so sickening it made my stomach turn. Vivian and Desmond had not just been skimming a little off the top. They had treated my grandfather's life savings like a bottomless personal slush fund. We found the first major discrepancy in Desmond's business accounts. My father had always fancied himself a visionary venture capitalist, despite having absolutely no business acumen. The data showed that just weeks after Vivian secured the power of attorney, massive unexplained withdrawals began bleeding out of Jeremiah's primary investment portfolio. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were liquidated and funneled directly into a series of shell companies Desmond had set up. High through Grandpa's hard-earned logistics money at dead-end tech startups, shady real estate developments, and foolish stock ventures. Every single one of them tanked. Lost nearly $1 million of stolen money trying to play the big-shot investor to his country club friends, and Vivian had covered his tracks by burying the losses in complex corporate tax filings. But Desmond's financial incompetence was nothing compared to Vivian's vanity. Chloe brought up a separate monitor tracking Vivian's personal spending alongside the estate's liquid assets. The timeline was undeniably clear. Every time Vivian needed to fund her extravagant lifestyle, another chunk of Grandpa's wealth mysteriously vanished. We mapped out wire transfers that lined up perfectly with her luxury vacations. There was a withdrawal of $40,000 just 3 days before Vivian and Desmond took a month-long trip to the Amalfi Coast. There was a liquidation of $75,000 immediately preceding Vivian's purchase of a rare limited edition designer handbag collection that she had proudly flaunted all over social media. I pulled up her old posts on my phone, cross-referencing the dates of her glamorous photos from Paris, Dubai, and Milan with the exact moments my grandfather's accounts were drained. She was drinking vintage champagne on private yachts paid for by the father she was supposedly caring for. The sheer entitlement was disgusting. They had kicked me out into the freezing rain for refusing to hand over my minimum wage paycheck, but they felt completely justified in stealing millions from a vulnerable, dying old man. I sat in the glow of the monitors, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. This was not just greed, this was systematic, calculated financial abuse. We dug deeper, cutting through the layers of obfuscation Vivian had tried to establish. She had hired mediocre accountants to hide the money trails, but they were no match for a top-tier cybersecurity firm. Chloe's fingers flew across her keyboard as she bypassed encrypted firewalls and unraveled the dummy accounts Vivian had set up to launder the funds. Then we hit the darkest corner of the audit. I asked Chloe to pull up the records for Grandpa Jeremiah's medical care fund. When his health first began to fail, Jeremiah had specifically designated a massive high-yield trust account strictly for his medical needs. The money was supposed to guarantee him the best quality of life possible. It was earmarked for round-the-clock at home, nursing staff, specialized physical therapy, top-tier medical equipment, and private physicians. He wanted to die with dignity in his own home, surrounded by excellent care. Chloe opened the ledger for the medical trust, and the room went completely silent. The account was virtually empty. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and sorrow. Vivian had systematically fired the expensive, highly qualified nursing staff Grandpa had requested. She replaced them with a cheap part-time care service that only checked on him a few hours a day. She had canceled his specialized physical therapy sessions, claiming he was too tired to participate. She had cut every single corner regarding his comfort and his health, leaving him isolated in that massive house. And she did it so she could steal the money. I stared at the screen as the transaction history loaded. Over a period of 18 months, Vivian had drained the medical trust through a series of escalating wire transfers. The funds meant to ensure her own father lived his final years in comfort were ruthlessly diverted. The most glaring discrepancy stared back at me from the digital ledger. It was a single massive wire transfer for exactly $150,000. It was executed just days after Grandpa's doctors recommended an intensive, expensive round-the-clock care regimen. Vivian had denied the doctor's request, citing a lack of liquid funds, and then immediately wired that exact amount out of the medical trust. "Trace it!" I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. "Trace that exact routing number. I want to know where every single penny of that $150,000 went." Chloe did not say a word. She simply typed. The forensic software locked onto the routing numbers, tracking the digital fingerprints of the stolen money as it bounced through two different intermediary bank accounts Vivian had set up to clean the funds. But digital money always leaves a trail, and my firm was the best in the world at following it. The software bypassed the intermediary banks and landed solidly on the final destination account. The screen blinked green, displaying the registered owner of the receiving account. It was not a medical supply company. It was not a private physician. It was an elite, ultra-luxury event planning agency based in Atlanta. I stared at the name of the agency, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with sickening clarity. I pulled out my phone and quickly searched the event planner's name alongside my sister's name. A barrage of glossy, high-resolution photographs flooded my screen. The timeline matched perfectly. The $150,000 drained from my grandfather's life-preserving medical fund had been wired directly to the event planners orchestrating Kiara and Connor's wedding. I looked at the photographs of my sister smiling in her custom-imported gown. I looked at the towering floral arrangements, the crystal centerpieces, the imported champagne, and the string quartet. I looked at Connor, the arrogant lawyer who had tried to bully me just hours ago, standing at the altar, looking incredibly pleased with himself. I looked at Vivian and Desmond beaming in the front row, playing the role of wealthy, generous parents, hosting the society event of the season. They had paid for their golden child's extravagant destination wedding by stealing the money meant to keep my grandfather breathing comfortably. They had literally sacrificed his health, his dignity, and his care to fund a party. A cold, absolute calm washed over me. The kind of calm that only comes when you realize the people you are fighting have absolutely no humanity left to appeal to. They were not just bad parents. They were criminals who had exploited a dying man for a photo opportunity. Chloe looked at me from across the glass table. She saw the shift in my posture, the deadly stillness in my eyes. She knew exactly what I was looking at on my phone. "Package this entire dataset," I instructed my team, my voice steady and devoid of all emotion. "Document every routing number, every signature, and every timestamp. Cross-reference the wire transfers with the event planner's invoices. I want this audit completely airtight, certified, and ready for criminal prosecution." I stood up from the conference table and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the Atlanta skyline. Vivian, Desmond, Connor, and Kiara thought they were untouchable. They thought their stolen wealth and their country club status made them invincible. They had no idea that I had just uncovered the exact weapon I needed to destroy their lives completely, and I was going to use it on the biggest stage possible. Chloe sat across from me in the server room, her expression matching the disgust I felt. We did not need to speak. The evidence was irrefutable. We had the smoking gun of their financial elder abuse completely locked down. But Vivian and Desmond had absolutely no idea that I held this evidence. They thought their biggest problem was my eviction notice. They thought they were fighting a simple battle over a house and a will. Because they were entirely ignorant of the forensic audit I had just completed, they decided to do what they always did when backed into a corner. They played the victim. My phone vibrated violently against the glass table. It was not a call from Connor's law firm. It was a rapid-fire series of notifications from social media. I had not looked at my personal accounts in days, but now my screen was flooded with alerts. I unlocked the device and opened the application. Vivian had gone to work. She had crafted a meticulously manipulative, deeply calculating public post. There was a photo of her and Desmond looking perfectly distraught, holding hands, and staring sadly into the camera. The caption was a masterclass in gaslighting. She wrote a sprawling essay about the heartbreak of elder abuse, but she twisted the narrative entirely. She painted herself as the devoted, exhausted caretaker who had sacrificed the last 5 years of her life to nurse her beloved father through severe dementia. Then she introduced the villain of her story, me. Vivian told our entire social circle and extended family that her estranged, troubled daughter had suddenly reappeared after 19 years of silence. She claimed I swooped in during my grandfather's final, most vulnerable days. She blatantly lied, writing that I had preyed on an old man's failing mind, coercing him into signing a fraudulent will that cut out the family who actually loved and cared for him. She ended the post by begging for prayers for our family, claiming they were exploring legal avenues to protect her father's true legacy from a manipulative gold digger. It was a stunning piece of fiction. It painted me as a ruthless predator and them as the grieving noble protectors. The post was designed to completely destroy my reputation before I even had a chance to defend myself. And the worst part was that it was working. Within an hour of the post going live, the harassment began. The extended family members who had bought into Vivian's lies for the last 19 years immediately mobilized into an attacking army. My aunts, uncles, and distant cousins began blowing up my phone. My text messages turned into a war zone. One aunt sent a massive paragraph calling me a parasite. She said I was exactly the same selfish teenager who had run away, only now I had upgraded to stealing from dying men. A cousin left a venomous voicemail shouting that I had no right to show my face and take money I never earned. They called me a thief. They called me a gold digger. They accused me of preying on a man whose mind was gone. They demanded I sign the estate back over to Vivian and Desmond immediately, or face the wrath of the entire family. They threatened to expose me to my clients, completely unaware that my clients were global defense contractors who trusted me with national security secrets, not neighborhood gossip. Kiara even posted a video of herself crying in her luxury vehicle, wiping away fake tears as she begged her followers to share the story of how her evil older sister was rendering her family homeless. Connor shared the post on his professional network, attempting to leverage his status as an attorney to legitimize their claims. He added a caption stating that justice would be served against those who manipulate the elderly. The sheer hypocrisy of the man who had just tried to extort me in a coffee shop was staggering. The vitriol was relentless. My phone screen lit up every 10 seconds with another hateful message from someone who shared my blood but knew absolutely nothing about my life. For a brief, fleeting moment, the old wounds from my teenage years flared up. I felt the familiar sting of being the family scapegoat, the one everyone was so eager to hate. But I was not a terrified 16-year-old girl anymore. I was a 35-year-old self-made powerhouse, and I did not flinch under pressure. Chloe looked at my phone, buzzing furiously on the desk. "You want me to shut them down?" she asked, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "I can wipe their accounts or drop a fraction of this audit online right now. We can end this smear campaign in 2 minutes." I shook my head, my eyes locked on the vitriolic text messages. "No," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Let them talk. Let them type every single defamatory lie they want. Let Vivian dig this hole as deep as she possibly can. Never interrupt your enemy when they are making a massive mistake." I refused to engage online. I did not type a single defensive reply. I did not post a counter statement. I did not answer a single aggressive phone call from my furious aunts and uncles. I went completely and utterly silent on every public front. I let Vivian believe her smear campaign was working. I let Desmond think his social standing was secure. I let them bask in the outpouring of fake sympathy from their country club friends. My silence was not a surrender. It was an ambush in the making. Instead of wasting my energy screaming on the internet, I channeled every ounce of my focus into compiling the ultimate weapon. Chloe and I spent the next 48 hours building an airtight, irrefutable criminal fraud packet. We did not just print out bank statements. We constructed a devastating narrative of raw data. We took Vivian's tearful social media post, where she claimed to be a devoted, exhausted caretaker, and we placed it right next to the high-resolution photos of her sipping champagne in a private cabana in Dubai during the exact weeks she claimed to be nursing my grandfather. We took the receipts for Kiara's towering wedding cake and the imported floral arrangements, and we cross-referenced them with the cancelled invoices from the specialized physical therapists my grandfather desperately needed. We highlighted the routing numbers that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Vivian and Desmond had committed felony embezzlement. We organized the evidence into thick, heavy binders. We backed everything up on encrypted drives. We verified the metadata so no defense attorney could ever claim the documents were altered. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It was undeniable proof of financial elder abuse, a crime that carried severe mandatory prison sentences. My phone continued to buzz with hateful messages from cousins who thought they were defending a righteous mother. I simply silenced the device and tossed it into my bag. Let them call me a gold digger. Let them call me a manipulator. The court of public opinion meant absolutely nothing compared to a federal indictment. I picked up the thick binder of criminal evidence and felt the sheer, undeniable weight of it in my hands. Vivian had weaponized her social media to try and break me, but she had brought a localized rumor mill to a corporate war. She thought she was controlling the narrative by crying on the internet. She had no idea that I was holding the key to her actual prison cell. I looked at Chloe, who was securing the final digital backups into our heavily fortified server. "We have everything we need," I announced, securing the binder into my leather briefcase. "Vivian and Desmond want to play the victims for their high society friends. They want to use Connor's corporate connections to make themselves look untouchable. So we are going to take this directly to their audience. We are not just going to beat them in a courtroom. We are going to publicly destroy them in front of the very people they are trying so hard to impress." I walked out of the secure server room with the absolute certainty of a predator who had cornered its prey. The smear campaign was nothing but noise. The real reckoning was coming, and I was going to deliver it flawlessly. The invitation had been sitting on the edge of my glass desk for 3 months. Caldwell and Pierce, the elite corporate law firm, where Connor strutted around as a newly minted junior partner, hosted an annual philanthropic gala in downtown Atlanta. It was the premier high society event of the season, a glittering, opulent playground where the city's wealthiest elites gathered to drink vintage champagne network aggressively and pretend they cared deeply about charitable causes. Tonight, it was also the exact stage Vivian and Desmond had chosen for their grand pity party. I sat in the center of my penthouse living room, a high-resolution tablet resting on my lap, watching their performance unfold in real time. Kiara had gone live on her social media accounts the very moment their rented limousine pulled up to the venue. She was wearing a sequined gown that cost more than most working families made in a year, holding her phone high to capture the flashing cameras of local society photographers. In the background of the live stream, Vivian was already hard at work. I zoomed in on the high-definition footage. My mother was clutching the arm of a prominent real estate developer, dabbing at her dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. She was working the room with the surgical precision of a seasoned con artist, portraying the devastated, heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. Through the muffled, overlapping audio of Kiara's broadcast, I could catch distinct fragments of Vivian's perfectly rehearsed script. She was telling everyone who would listen that an estranged, deeply troubled daughter had suddenly reappeared out of nowhere to manipulate her dying father. She was soliciting sympathy from Atlanta's most powerful socialites, claiming that I was ruthlessly attempting to seize the family home and leave them utterly destitute on the streets. Desmond was doing his part over by the open bar, cornering potential investors and aggressively trying to secure emergency bridge loans to cover the massive financial hole they were about to fall into. They were utilizing Connor's VIP access to squeeze every single ounce of leverage out of the evening. Connor himself was clearly visible near the grand marble staircase, shaking hands with senior partners, grinning like a man who held the keys to the city. They were terrified of the eviction notice and the looming threat of my audit, so they were trying to build an impenetrable fortress of public support. They truly believed that if they could convince the city's elite that I was a greedy monster, my accusations of elder abuse would be dismissed as the ravings of a bitter child. What Vivian, Desmond, Kiara, and Connor absolutely failed to realize was that their glittering fortress belonged entirely to me. Caldwell and Pierce prided themselves on hosting the most extravagant charity gala in the state, but such massive events required substantial corporate backing. 2 months ago, the senior managing partners had approached Vanguard Cyber Defense for a charitable donation. I did not just donate a few $1,000s. I instructed my finance team to secure the platinum sponsorship. My firm completely bankrolled the venue, the five-star catering, the state-of-the-art AV equipment, and the live entertainment. However, I had mandated a strict non-disclosure agreement ensuring that our corporate sponsorship remained strictly anonymous until the night of the event. The law firm agreed without hesitation, eager to secure the massive influx of capital. Connor was parading his in-laws around a magnificent ballroom paid for by the very woman he had attempted to extort in a coffee shop. He was sipping top-shelf whiskey funded by the high school dropout his wife utterly despised. The sheer delicious irony of the situation was intoxicating. I locked the tablet screen and set it down on the glass coffee table. I did not need to watch their digital broadcast any longer. I was about to give them an unedited live performance they would never forget. Strong, reassuring hands settled gently onto my bare shoulders. I tilted my head back, looking upside down into the warm, steady eyes of my fiancé Trey. He was already dressed in a tailored jet-black tuxedo that fit his broad, athletic frame perfectly. Trey was a brilliant architectural engineer, a man who built physical skyscrapers with the same meticulous care I used to build digital firewalls. He knew the absolute depths of my past. He knew about the rainy porch, the stolen college funds, the 19 years of silence, and the staggering embezzlement I had uncovered. He leaned down and kissed my forehead, his touch grounding me immediately. "Are we ready to burn their house of cards to the ground?" Trey asked, a slow, confident smile spreading across his handsome face. "We are going to completely incinerate it," I replied, standing up to face him. I turned toward the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my dressing room to assess my own armor. I had selected a breathtaking emerald green silk gown that draped flawlessly across my figure. It was a powerful statement piece, radiating wealth, uncompromising authority, and untouchable status. My hair was styled in a sleek, elegant updo that exposed the sharp line of my jaw and the brilliant cut diamonds resting heavy against my collarbones. I looked exactly like the apex predator of the corporate world. There was no trace of the terrified, discarded 16-year-old girl anywhere in my reflection. I took a deep, centering breath, feeling the cool silk glide against my skin. I was not walking into that ballroom to scream or throw an emotional tantrum. I was walking in as the executioner. Chloe strode into the penthouse living room, adjusting the cuffs of a sharp-tailored white tuxedo suit. She carried a sleek silver briefcase containing the encrypted flash drives, holding the devastating financial evidence. Our entire legal and technical strategy was loaded onto those drives, formatted specifically to interface seamlessly with the venue's massive projection screens. I already coordinated with the lead audiovisual technician at the hotel. Chloe announced, her eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. "Because Vanguard is the anonymous platinum sponsor, we have unrestricted direct administrative access to the main stage network. When you give the signal during the keynote presentation, I will bypass their standard slideshow and push our raw data feed directly to the massive screens behind the podium. Connor's technical team will be completely locked out. They will not be able to pull the plug, cut the feed, or hijack the display. We have total control of the room." "Perfect," I said, grabbing my emerald clutch from the vanity. "Let us go introduce my parents to their new reality." The three of us descended to the underground parking garage where a convoy of three black vehicles waited in the shadows. Trey and I slid into the back of the lead SUV, while Chloe and a specialized private security detail took the remaining vehicles. The drive into downtown Atlanta was a quiet, intensely focused journey. The neon lights of the city reflected off the tinted windows, illuminating the sharp, determined angles of Trey's profile. He reached over and laced his fingers securely through mine, offering a silent, unwavering current of support. He did not tell me to calm down or be careful. He knew exactly what had to be done to protect my grandfather's legacy, and he was there to stand beside me while I executed the plan. The convoy navigated through the bustling downtown traffic, eventually turning onto the Grand Avenue leading to the luxury hotel hosting the event. A massive crowd of wealthy socialites, local politicians, and corporate elites milled around the velvet-roped red carpet entrance. Valet attendants rushed back and forth, opening the doors of luxury sedans and exotic sports cars. I watched through the dark glass as the wealthiest members of Atlanta society greeted each other with fake smiles and exaggerated air kisses. This was Vivian's absolute dream world. This was the exact environment she had sacrificed my childhood to enter. She had stolen a dying man's critical medical funds just to secure a VIP table in this room and maintain this glittering facade. The lead SUV pulled to a smooth, commanding stop right at the head of the red carpet. Flashbulbs from local society photographers immediately began to pop rapidly, capturing the arrival of the next wealthy donor. The driver stepped out and pulled open my heavy door. The humid evening air rushed into the cabin, carrying the distinct sounds of live jazz music and overlapping pretentious conversations. Trey stepped out first, smoothly adjusting his jacket before turning to offer me his hand. I placed my palm firmly in his, stepping out onto the plush red carpet. The emerald green silk of my gown caught the brilliant flashes of the cameras, instantly drawing the attention of the surrounding crowd. Chloe flanked my right side, the silver briefcase gripped tightly in her hand like a loaded weapon. Our private security details seamlessly formed a subtle, highly protective perimeter around us as we moved toward the grand entrance. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman who owned the ground she stood on. Curious whispers rippled through the gathered crowd as we approached the grand double doors. People were trying to identify the stunning African-American woman commanding such a heavy, elite corporate presence. The event coordinators standing at the front desk scrambled to locate our names on the massive guest list. They did not know they were about to welcome the anonymous benefactor who had single-handedly funded their entire evening. They also did not know they were ushering in the absolute, undeniable destruction of one of their junior partners. I squared my shoulders, locked my gaze dead ahead, and crossed the threshold into the glittering, dangerous heart of my family's stolen paradise. The heavy mahogany, double doors swung inward smoothly, pulled open by two white-gloved attendants who bowed slightly as we passed. The blast of orchestral jazz music and the overwhelming scent of expensive floral arrangements hit me instantly. The charity gala was in full and glorious swing. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over hundreds of the city's most elite residents. Waiters glided silently across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays of champagne flutes. I paused just inside the threshold, letting my eyes adjust to the sheer scale of the event. Trey stood tall beside me, his presence an immovable anchor. Chloe stood to my right, her grip tight on the silver briefcase holding their ultimate destruction. We did not rush our entrance. We walked down the sweeping grand staircase with the slow, deliberate pacing of royalty inspecting their court. The emerald silk of my gown swept behind me, commanding attention from every table we passed. Heads turned, conversations stalled. People who had spent their entire lives evaluating wealth and status were desperately trying to place me. I radiated the kind of quiet, absolute authority that could not be faked or borrowed. I scanned the massive ballroom with tactical precision. It did not take long to locate the parasites. They had positioned themselves near the center of the room, loudly holding court beside an extravagant ice sculpture. Kiara was laughing shrilly at something an older partner had said, her imported silk dress catching the light. Desmond was nodding along, playing the role of the distinguished patriarch while sipping from a highball glass. Vivian was holding a crystal flute, her diamond earrings sparkling as she worked the crowd for sympathy. I kept my gaze locked on them as I descended the final few stairs. The moment of discovery happened in slow motion. Vivian turned her head to check the room and her eyes landed squarely on me. Her fake practiced smile vanished instantly. Her champagne flute tilted precariously, spilling a few drops onto the expensive carpet. She tapped Desmond urgently on the arm. He turned, his jaw dropping as he took in the sight of the daughter he had kicked into the freezing rain, now commanding the attention of the entire ballroom. Kiara and Connor followed their gaze. The absolute bewilderment painted across their faces was a masterpiece. They looked at my custom gown, the flawless diamonds at my throat, and the formidable security detail trailing discreetly behind us. Their brains short-circuited. They could not reconcile the destitute, troubled runaway of their fictional narrative with the magnificent woman standing before them. Panic immediately overrode their confusion. Vivian handed her glass to Desmond and began marching toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was terrified that my presence would shatter the fragile illusion she had spent all evening building for her high society friends. Connor fell into step right beside her, his chest puffed out, eager to play the fierce protector of his in-laws. They intercepted me just before I reached the center of the ballroom, stepping directly into my path to block my progress. Vivian leaned in close, attempting to keep her voice low to avoid drawing further attention, but the venom in her tone was unmistakable. "Maya, what on earth are you doing here?" Vivian hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the nearby guests. "You have absolutely no right to show up at this event and cause a scene. This is a private, exclusive function. You cannot just crash a corporate gala because you are angry about a house. You need to turn around and walk out those doors right now before you humiliate yourself entirely." I looked down at her. She looked so small, so desperate, grasping at the last shreds of her imaginary control. I did not move a single inch. "I am exactly where I intend to be." "Vivian," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly level, "I highly suggest you lower your tone before you cause the exact scene you are so terrified of." Connor stepped forward, attempting to physically block my view of the room. His arrogant sneer was back in full force. "Listen to your mother," Maya. Connor spat, using his harsh, commanding lawyer voice. "I warned you about harassing this family. This gala is hosted by my firm. It is a highly restricted guest list for major donors and invited dignitaries only. I am a partner here and I will not allow you to trespass and harass my guests. You are leaving immediately." I simply smiled at him. "I am not leaving, Connor." Connor's face flushed with anger. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone. "I am not going to argue with an unhinged trespasser," he declared loudly, ensuring a few nearby partners could hear his display of authority. "I am calling the hotel security team right now. You are going to be escorted off this property, and I will be filing a restraining order against you first thing Monday morning." Kiara arrived just in time to hear this threat. She crossed her arms, shooting me a triumphant, malicious glare, fully believing her husband had just won the battle. Connor dialed the security desk, but before he could even raise the phone to his ear, a frantic voice called out across the marble floor. Mr. Pierce, the senior managing partner of the firm, was rushing toward us. Right behind him was the chief event coordinator, a highly stressed woman holding a digital tablet. She looked absolutely horrified. Connor puffed his chest out even further, assuming the senior partner was coming to assist him in removing the intruder. "Sir," Connor said, turning to his boss, with an eager, sickeningly respectful smile. "I apologize for this disturbance. This woman is an estranged relative who managed to sneak past the front desk. I am handling it. Security is on their way to remove her." Mr. Pierce did not even look at Connor. He completely ignored his junior partner and stepped directly in front of me. To the absolute horror of my family, the senior managing partner of the most powerful law firm in Atlanta bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "Miss Washington," Mr. Pierce said, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the ballroom, "I cannot express how thrilled we are that you decided to attend in person tonight. We were deeply concerned when your corporate office requested strict anonymity for your sponsorship." The event coordinator stepped forward, her face pale as she glared viciously at Connor. Mr. Connor stepped aside immediately. She ordered, her voice shaking with panic and rage. "You are speaking to the platinum benefactor of this entire gala. Miss Washington and Vanguard Cyber Defense fully funded this evening. She is our guest of honor. The words hit Connor like a physical blow. The phone slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the hard floor. He stared at the event coordinator, then at his senior partner, and finally at me. His jaw literally dropped open. The color vanished from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. Vivian stumbled backward, bumping into Desmond, who had to grab her arm to keep her from falling over. Kiara let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Their brains simply could not process the reality crashing down on them. The woman they had just threatened to throw out into the street was the woman who had paid for the floor they were standing on. I looked at Connor, letting my eyes sweep over him with absolute, unadulterated contempt. "You are saying something about calling security to remove the uninvited guests," I noted mildly. "Because if we are checking the guest list for major donors, I am fairly certain your entire family is currently drinking my champagne for free." Mr. Pierce turned to Connor, his eyes narrowing into a sharp, dangerous glare. "Connor, is there a problem here?" the senior partner asked, his tone laced with a lethal warning. "Are you harassing our most vital corporate sponsor?" "No, sir," Connor stammered, his voice cracking pitifully. He was shrinking right in front of me, his professional career hanging by a tiny fraying thread. "There is no problem. It was a misunderstanding. I am so sorry." I did not wait for him to finish his pathetic apology. I did not spare Vivian, Desmond, or Kiara another glance. I turned my attention back to the event coordinator. "Please show us to our table," I requested politely. "Right this way, Miss Washington," she replied, practically bowing as she led the way through the parted crowd. Trey placed his hand firmly on the small of my back, guiding me forward. Chloe followed close behind, her silver briefcase swinging in time with her steps. We walked right past my shattered, humiliated family. I left them standing near the ice sculpture, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their own insignificance. The entire ballroom seemed to part for me as I was escorted directly to the head table situated front and center right beneath the main stage. The most powerful people in the city nodded to me as I passed, offering their respect and admiration. I took my seat at the center of the long, velvet-draped table. A waiter immediately materialized, pouring a generous measure of vintage champagne into my crystal flute. I picked up the glass and looked back across the massive room. Vivian, Desmond, Kiara, and Connor were still standing exactly where I had left them. They looked like terrified ghosts, haunting a castle they no longer belonged to. They were staring at me, terrified, bewildered, and completely stripped of their power. The first strike had been executed flawlessly, but the night was far from over. The real destruction had not even begun yet. I took a slow sip of my champagne, savoring the taste of absolute control, and waited for the speeches to begin. The clinking of silverware against fine china eventually faded as the event coordinators signaled the transition to the evening formal program. I sat perfectly composed at the center of the head table, the emerald silk of my gown pooling around my chair. My fiancé Trey rested his hand over mine, his thumb drawing slow, reassuring circles against my skin. To my right, Chloe had her silver briefcase open, her fingers resting lightly on the encrypted drive plugged into a secure terminal provided by the audiovisual team. We had tested the connection twice. We had absolute control over the massive dual projection screens flanking the main stage. From my vantage point, I had a completely unobstructed view of Vivian, Desmond, Kiara, and Connor. The event staff had relegated them to a secondary table near the back of the VIP section, a sharp demotion from the prime seating Connor had likely expected. Vivian was picking nervously at her catered salmon, her usual predatory confidence replaced by a twitchy, paranoid energy. Desmond was gripping his wine glass like a lifeline, his eyes darting toward my table every few seconds. They knew I was holding a weapon, but they lacked the imagination to comprehend its scale. They thought this was merely a family dispute over a house. They had no idea they were sitting at ground zero of a forensic detonation. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, bathing the audience in a soft, dramatic blue hue. Mr. Pierce, the senior managing partner of the law firm, stepped up to the acrylic podium on the main stage. He adjusted his microphone, his deep, resonant voice echoing across the cavernous room. He delivered a polished, charismatic opening address, highlighting the charitable foundation the gala supported and thanking the city elite for their continued generosity. The crowd applauded politely, the sound rippling through the sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. Now we come to the most important moment of our evening. Mr. Pierce announced, his tone shifting to one of profound reverence. A charity event of this magnitude is entirely impossible without the extraordinary generosity of our corporate sponsors. Tonight, we are incredibly honored to be completely underwritten by an organization that represents the absolute pinnacle of corporate security and technological innovation. It is my great privilege to introduce the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Cyber Defense, our platinum benefactor, Miss Maya Washington. A bright, focused spotlight swung instantly to my seat. The applause that erupted was deafening, fueled by the sheer curiosity of Atlanta high society. I stood up smoothly, releasing tray hand. I smoothed the front of my gown and walked toward the stage with the slow, deliberate pacing of an apex predator. I did not rush. I climbed the short flight of stairs, the heavy fabric of my dress brushing against the carpet, and stepped behind the podium. Mr. Pierce offered me a warm, deeply respectful smile as he stepped aside, granting me total control of the room. I looked out over the sea of faces. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the state were staring up at me, hanging on my every word. I found Vivian and Desmond instantly. They were frozen in their chairs, their faces illuminated by the ambient light of the stage. Connor was sitting rigidly beside them, looking like a man marching toward the gallows. "Good evening," I began, my voice ringing out through the state-of-the-art sound system. It was chillingly professional, devoid of any tremble or hesitation. "I am Maya Washington. While many of you know me through my work in the cybersecurity sector, I stand before you tonight in a much more personal capacity. I am here to honor the legacy of my late grandfather, Jeremiah Washington." The room was pin-drop silent. I let the weight of his name settle over the crowd. My grandfather was a man who built a logistics empire from the ground up. I continued, my gaze locking directly onto Desmond, who visibly flinched. He was a pioneer, a self-made titan, who believed that true wealth was measured by integrity, hard work, and the protection of the vulnerable. He spent his entire life providing for his family, ensuring that the people he loved would never have to experience the hardships he overcame. He believed that family was a sacred trust. I paused, letting my eyes shift slowly to Vivian. She stopped breathing. Her hands were clutching the edge of her table so hard her knuckles were bone white. Unfortunately, I stated my tone, dropping a fraction of a degree into something sharp and deadly. Not everyone shares those values. Sometimes the greatest threats we face do not come from anonymous hackers or external corporate espionage. Sometimes the most vicious predators are sitting right at our own dinner tables. A quiet murmur rippled through the front rows. People were exchanging confused, intrigued glances. This was not a standard philanthropic speech, and the elite crowd could smell the impending scandal. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I reached out and tapped the small wireless presenter on the podium. It was the signal. Behind me, the massive dual projection screens instantly shifted. The elegant swirling logo of the charity gala vanished. In its place, stark high-definition financial documents illuminated the entire ballroom. The sudden burst of white light from the screens cast harsh shadows across the audience. As a cybersecurity professional, I deal in absolute facts. I explained, my voice echoing powerfully through the speakers. I deal in metadata, routing numbers, and irrefutable digital footprints. As the sole legal executor of Jeremiah Washington Estate, I recently initiated a comprehensive forensic audit of his financial history over the last 5 years. That timeline corresponds exactly with the period during which his physical health began to fail, and his daughter Vivian assumed his medical and financial power of attorney. I clicked the presenter again. The screen zoomed in on a specific ledger. I guided the audience through the data with the clinical precision of a surgeon. "What you are looking at is a legally designated high-yield medical trust," I said. "My grandfather established this fund for one specific purpose: to ensure he received round-the-clock specialized nursing care during his final years. He wanted to die with dignity in his own home." You will notice a formal request filed by his primary care physician begging for specialized physical therapists and 24-hour monitoring. I clicked to the next slide. A large red denial stamp appeared next to an email transcript. That medical request was explicitly denied by his power of attorney due to a supposed lack of liquid funds, I stated coldly. My grandfather was left isolated, denied the care that could have eased his suffering. The ballroom was dead silent. The heavy, suffocating weight of the truth was pressing down on the crowd. I could see the absolute horror registering on the faces of the senior law partners sitting near the front. I clicked the presenter a third time. The screen transitioned to a massive, undeniable bank wire transfer record. However, I continued, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. The funds were not missing. They were simply being redirected. 3 days after denying my grandfather his essential medical care, Vivian executed this exact wire transfer. She drained $150,000 directly from the life-preserving medical trust. I clicked again. The screen split in half. On the left side was the bank routing number for the stolen $150,000. On the right side was an itemized, highly detailed invoice from an elite luxury event planning agency based right here in Atlanta. The routing numbers matched flawlessly. A thick red line connected the stolen funds directly to the vendor. The money stolen from a dying man medical fund was wired directly to this luxury event planner, I announced, ensuring every single person in the room heard the words clearly. It was not used for medication. It was not used for nurses. It was used to pay for imported floral arrangements, a string quartet, and crystal centerpieces. It was used to entirely fund the lavish destination wedding of my sister Kiara and her husband Connor, a junior partner at this very law firm. The ballroom erupted. The silence shattered into a chaotic symphony of gasps, shocked whispers, and quiet exclamations of pure disgust. The carefully maintained polite facade of Atlanta society dissolved instantly. I looked directly at Connor Table. Mr. Pierce and the other senior managing partners of the law firm had turned completely around in their chairs. They were staring at Connor with absolute unfiltered revulsion. Connor was shrinking into his seat, his face a sickly shade of gray, looking like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. He had paraded his expensive wedding around the office for months, bragging about his high society in-laws. Now his bosses knew his entire marriage celebration was funded by the brutal financial abuse of an elderly man. "This is a lie!" Vivian suddenly shrieked. She shot up from her chair, her voice shrill and panicked, echoing horribly over the murmurs of the crowd. She pointed a trembling finger at the stage. "She is lying. Those documents are fabricated." My father was confused. "He told me to use that money. She is a runaway. She is trying to ruin us." I did not yell back. I leaned closer to the microphone, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register that commanded total silence. "Bank routing numbers do not lie, Vivian," I said. "The digital metadata on those wire transfers has been certified by top-tier forensic accountants. The invoices matching your exact wedding dates are signed in your own handwriting. You treated a vulnerable dying man life savings, like a slush fund for your vanity. You sacrificed his dignity for a photo opportunity." Vivian opened her mouth to scream again, but Desmond grabbed her arm, pulling her harshly back down into her seat. He was looking wildly around the room, realizing that every single person they had ever tried to impress was currently watching their utter destruction. Their country club friends were staring at them like they were covered in toxic waste. Kiara was sobbing openly, hiding her face behind her hands, the illusion of her perfect life completely annihilated. I stood tall behind the podium, letting the undeniable reality of their crimes sink into the bones of every person in the room. I had stripped away their masks. I had ripped away their status. I had exposed the rotten, greedy core of the family that threw me away 19 years ago. Financial elder abuse is not just a moral failing, I concluded, my voice resolute and uncompromising. It is a severe felony. As the executor of Jeremiah Washington Estate, I have officially submitted this entire unredacted forensic packet to the district attorney office. I am pressing full criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. I stepped away from the podium. I did not wait for applause. I did not wait for Mr. Pierce to return to the stage. I simply turned my back on the massive screens displaying the evidence of their crimes and walked down the stairs. The crowd parted for me immediately, stepping back in a mixture of awe and intimidation. I took Trey's arm, gave Chloe a single nod, and walked out of the ballroom, leaving my family trapped in the inescapable wreckage of their own making. Exactly 14 days after I turned their glittering high society gala into a public execution, we traded the crystal chandeliers of the ballroom for the harsh fluorescent lights of the Fulton County Probate Court. The air inside the courtroom was stale, smelling of floor wax and desperation. I sat at the heavy oak defense table, perfectly composed in a tailored charcoal suit, my posture radiating the quiet, immovable confidence of a woman who had already won the war. Trey sat immediately to my right, his presence a solid grounding force. On my left sat Mr. Sterling, my grandfather's estate attorney, alongside a top-tier litigator I had retained specifically for this battle. Across the center aisle, Vivian and Desmond sat at the petitioner's table. They looked absolutely hollowed out. The 14 days since the gala had not been kind to them. Vivian was not wearing her usual ostentatious designer labels. Instead, she had dressed in a drab conservative navy dress, deliberately trying to project the image of a humble grieving daughter. But her eyes betrayed her. They were bloodshot and darting frantically around the room. Desmond looked like he had aged a decade in 2 weeks. His shoulders were slumped and he stared straight ahead with a blank, terrified expression. They were entirely bankrupt of social capital, facing a looming criminal investigation for elder financial abuse, and staring down the barrel of an eviction notice. This courtroom was their absolute last stand. It was a desperate Hail Mary to invalidate the living trust, break my grandfather's final addendum, and claw back the millions they felt entitled to. And leading their doomed cavalry charge was Connor. Connor was currently standing at the podium, arranging and rearranging his legal pads with shaking hands. His usual arrogant swagger was completely gone. He looked exhausted, frantic, and entirely out of his depth. The senior partners at his law firm had predictably suspended him the morning after the charity gala, placing him on indefinite unpaid leave, pending a full internal review. His career was effectively over, his reputation was in ashes, and his marriage to Kiara was undoubtedly hanging by a thread of shared financial panic. He was not representing Vivian and Desmond out of familial loyalty. He was representing them because he desperately needed to win a percentage of my grandfather's estate to save his own life. The presiding judge, an imposing no-nonsense woman named Judge Harrison, struck her gavel and called the session to order. She peered down from the elevated bench, her sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Connor. She instructed him to proceed with his petition to contest the testamentary capacity of the late Jeremiah Washington. Connor cleared his throat, gripped the edges of the wooden podium, and began his opening statement. He started by aggressively attacking my grandfather's mental state. Connor paced the floor, his voice pitching higher as he attempted to weave a tragic, entirely fabricated narrative. He claimed that over the last 5 years, Jeremiah had suffered a catastrophic cognitive decline. He told the judge that my grandfather was a confused, vulnerable old man who could barely remember his own name, let alone execute complex living trusts and legal addendums. It was a repulsive, infuriating lie. Grandpa Jeremiah's body had been failing him, but his mind had remained as sharp as cut glass right up until his final breath. He had built a logistics empire, and he possessed an intellect that outmatched every single person sitting at that petitioner's table combined. Hearing Connor drag my grandfather's dignity through the mud made my blood run cold, but I did not flinch. I kept my face an absolute unreadable mask. Connor then turned his desperate narrative toward me. He pointed an accusing finger at our defense table and painted me as a ruthless, manipulative predator. He told the court that I was an estranged daughter who had run away and vanished for nearly 2 decades. He claimed that I had suddenly slithered back into the picture specifically to prey on a dying man with dementia. He argued that I had isolated Jeremiah from his loving, devoted daughter Vivian, poisoned his mind against his family, and coerced him into signing away a multi-million-dollar estate. Mr. Sterling leaned toward me, his brow furrowed in legal indignation. The opposing counsel is blatantly mischaracterizing the timeline and the medical records. Mr. Sterling whispered, his hand hovering over his legal pad. I should object to this line of argument right now. He is attempting to conflate physical ailments with cognitive impairment. I reached out and placed my hand gently but firmly over Mr. Sterling's wrist. No, I whispered back, my voice barely audible but carrying absolute authority. Let him speak. Do not interrupt him. Do not object to a single word. Let him read it all into the official court record. Mr. Sterling looked at me, understanding dawning in his eyes, and gave a sharp, imperceptible nod. He sat back in his chair and folded his hands. Trey shifted slightly next to me, his knee resting solidly against mine in a silent show of solidarity. He knew exactly what I was doing. I wanted Connor to talk. I wanted him to pace that courtroom and confidently declare under the penalty of perjury that my grandfather was mentally incapacitated. I wanted him to formally bind himself, Vivian and Desmond, to this specific fraudulent legal strategy. The more he spoke, the deeper he dug his own grave. Every fabricated claim, every exaggerated medical symptom, and every false accusation he entered into the court reporter's transcript was another undeniable piece of evidence for his impending disbarment, ignorant to the trap closing around him. Connor grew emboldened by our silence. He assumed our lack of objections meant he was winning the argument. He pulled a thin stack of papers from his folder and approached the judge's bench. Your Honor, Connor announced, his voice regaining a fraction of its old arrogance. I present to the court selected medical records from Jeremiah Washington's primary care physician, dated 3 years ago. These records clearly indicate that the deceased suffered a severe stroke that permanently compromised his neurological function. We argue that from that date forward, he lacked the legal testamentary capacity required to draft a living trust, change his beneficiaries, or execute the final addendum that disinherited his only daughter. Connor was cherry-picking. He had pulled isolated pages from a massive medical file, completely omitting the follow-up evaluations, the specialized neurological clearances, and the explicit competency certifications Grandpa Jeremiah had mandated before signing anything. Connor was attempting to build a narrative out of half-truths, relying on the judge's potential sympathy for a grieving daughter. Therefore, Connor concluded, stepping back to the center of the aisle and puffing his chest out. We respectfully request that this court immediately invalidate the recent living trust, strike down the final addendum, freeze all associated liquid assets, and restore the previous will that rightfully leaves the estate to Vivian Washington. Furthermore, we ask that Maya Washington be stripped of her role as executor due to gross undue influence. Connor turned and walked back to the petitioner's table. Vivian reached up and grabbed his hand, offering him a tearful, hopeful look. Desmond actually managed a weak, tight-lipped smile. For one brief, fleeting moment, they truly believed they had executed a brilliant legal maneuver. They thought they had successfully weaponized the justice system to steal back the lifestyle they had embezzled from my grandfather. Judge Harrison looked over the thin stack of papers Connor had submitted. She adjusted her glasses, her expression carefully neutral, before shifting her gaze to our defense table. The court notes the petitioner's claims, Judge Harrison stated, her voice echoing in the quiet room. Does the defense have a response to these allegations of cognitive incapacity and undue influence? I stood up slowly. I did not rush. I buttoned the front of my charcoal suit jacket and stepped out from behind the defense table. I felt the collective gaze of my parents, my brother-in-law, and the entire courtroom lock onto me. I looked directly at Connor, offering him the same cold, empty smile I had given him in the coffee shop just 2 weeks prior. He had just spent 20 minutes spinning a fictional tragedy for the court, legally tethering himself and his in-laws to a massive, easily disprovable lie. He had played his final card and the board was now entirely mine. Yes, Your Honor, I replied, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the courtroom. The defense has a comprehensive response. We are prepared to unequivocally prove that the petitioner's claims are not merely factually incorrect, but constitute a deliberate, coordinated attempt to commit fraud upon this court. I turned slightly, gesturing for my lead litigator to bring forward our evidence. The air in the courtroom suddenly felt incredibly thin. Vivian's hopeful expression vanished. Desmond swallowed hard. Connor's brief moment of triumph evaporated, replaced by a sudden creeping realization that our silence during his opening statement was not a surrender. It was an ambush. I had let him walk blindly onto the battlefield, and now I was going to systematically dismantle his entire case, his career, and his future right in front of the judge. My lead litigator, Elias, a seasoned courtroom veteran, whose reputation alone struck fear into corporate lawyers, stood and approached the bench. He carried a stack of heavy-bound portfolios, sliding one copy to the court clerk and dropping another directly in front of Connor. The thud of the thick binder hitting the petitioner's table made Kiara physically flinch. Elias began by systematically destroying the medical narrative Connor had just attempted to sell. He introduced the complete, redacted neurological clearances. Grandpa Jeremiah had passed with flying colors just 24 hours before executing the living trust. He submitted sworn affidavits from the attending physicians confirming absolute cognitive lucidity. But we did not stop at simply proving capacity. We were there to prove malicious intent. Elias informed Judge Harrison that the defense intended to submit a multimedia exhibit that would fundamentally alter the context of this entire proceeding. He requested permission to project a video file recorded exactly 3 days prior to the execution of the final addendum. Connor leaped out of his chair, his voice cracking as he frantically objected. He cited procedural technicalities, claiming the defense was ambushing the court with unverified digital media. Judge Harrison peered over her glasses, her patience completely exhausted by Connor's desperate flailing. She bluntly overruled his objection, stating that since the core of his argument rested on the deceased's mental state, any contemporary recording of the deceased was highly relevant. She ordered the bailiff to dim the courtroom lights. The large television monitor mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life. The high-definition footage was crisp and perfectly lit. There, sitting behind his massive oak desk in his home office, was Grandpa Jeremiah. Seeing him again sent a sharp, unexpected ache through my chest. He looked physically frail, his shoulders wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, and the nasal cannula for his oxygen was clearly visible. But his eyes were like flint. They were dark, sharp, and burning with an unmistakable, furious intelligence. Sitting beside him in the video was Mr. Sterling, holding the exact trust documents we were currently debating. "My name is Jeremiah Washington." My grandfather's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers. His tone was deep, resonant, and completely unwavering. "The date is October 12th, and I am recording this statement of my own free will, without any coercion, to establish my absolute mental competency and to address the sickening betrayal of my own blood." Vivian let out a strangled gasp. She slumped back in her chair, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Desmond stared at the screen as if he were watching his own execution. "I am fully aware that my physical health is failing." Jeremiah continued, looking directly into the camera lens with lethal precision. "But my mind is as sharp as it was the day I built my company. I am recording this message because I know exactly what my daughter Vivian and my son-in-law Desmond will do when I am gone. They will claim I was confused. They will claim I was manipulated. They will do this because they are desperately trying to cover up the fact that they have been robbing me blind for the last 5 years." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporter seemed to hold her breath as her fingers flew across the stenography machine. "I trusted Vivian with my medical power of attorney," Jeremiah stated, his voice dripping with profound disgust. "I trusted her to ensure I received the round-the-clock care my doctors prescribed. Instead, she dismissed my nurses. She canceled my therapies. She left me isolated in this house so she could drain my designated medical trust to fund her vanity. I know exactly where the money went. I know about the luxury vacations. I know about Desmond's pathetic failed business ventures. And I know about the $150,000 wire transfer stolen from my health fund to pay for a lavish wedding for my granddaughter Kiara and her arrogant husband Connor." At the petitioner's table, Kiara burst into loud, hysterical tears. She buried her face in her arms, completely broken by the reality that her perfect wedding was funded by the brutal exploitation of a dying man. Connor sat entirely paralyzed. He did not move a single muscle. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring at the screen as his career, his marriage, and his freedom dissolved into vapor. "You thought I was just a blind, helpless old man," Jeremiah said, a harsh, victorious smile touching the corners of his mouth. "But you forgot who raised you. When I suspected the theft, I did not confront you. I did not give you the chance to hide the money or destroy the records. Instead, I secretly hired the best forensic cybersecurity firm in the country to audit my own accounts. I hired Vanguard Cyber Defense. I hired my brilliant granddaughter Maya. My mother let out a loud, wretched sob. She turned her head looking at me across the center aisle with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She finally understood the magnitude of the trap. I had not just appeared out of nowhere to claim a house. I had been inside their bank accounts, tracking their every move, invited in by the very man they were stealing from. I did not look away. I held her terrified gaze, letting her see the cold, absolute finality in my eyes. Maya is the only person in this family who possesses a shred of integrity, Jeremiah concluded, his voice ringing with absolute finality. She built an empire with her own 2 hands after Vivian and Desmond threw her away like trash. She is my sole heir, my chosen executor, and the rightful owner of my estate. To Vivian, Desmond, and Kiara, you are hereby disowned. You are dead to me. Do not dare contest this will, or the forensic audit Maya compiled will be handed directly to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. The video ended. The screen went completely black. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The sheer devastating power of my grandfather's final testament had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Elias stood up slowly in the dim light. "The defense rests, Your Honor," he said quietly. Judge Harrison ordered the bailiff to turn the lights back on. She sat at her elevated bench, face a mask of furious, righteous indignation. She looked down at the petitioner's table with a level of contempt that made the air feel freezing cold. She did not bother asking Connor for a rebuttal. There was absolutely nothing he could say. He had just been exposed on the official court record as a knowing participant in the embezzlement of a dying man's medical funds. "This court has presided over hundreds of probate disputes." Judge Harrison began, her voice slicing through the heavy silence like a whip. "But I have rarely witnessed a display of greed, deceit, and moral bankruptcy as profound as what the petitioners have brought into my courtroom today. You filed this contest claiming a lack of mental capacity. Instead, this court has been presented with irrefutable multimedia evidence that the deceased was not only fully competent, but was actively investigating your criminal financial abuse prior to his death." Judge Harrison picked up her gavel, but she did not strike it yet. She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Connor. "Mr. Connor, as an officer of the court, your conduct in filing this frivolous, fraudulent petition borders on the criminal," Judge Harrison stated coldly. "You attempted to use the judicial system to facilitate the ongoing theft of an estate you personally embezzled from. You are a disgrace to the bar. I am immediately referring this transcript, the video exhibit, and the forensic accounting binders to the State Bar Association for a full disciplinary review. I highly suggest you retain criminal defense counsel by the end of the day." Connor dropped his head onto the wooden table. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply collapsed under the weight of his own destruction. As for the petition to invalidate the living trust and the final addendum, Judge Harrison continued, turning her wrath toward Vivian and Desmond, "This contest is dismissed with prejudice. You have absolutely no standing, no evidence, and no credibility. Furthermore, based on the clear, undeniable proof of financial elder abuse presented to this court today, I am issuing an immediate civil judgment. Vivian, Desmond, and Kiara are hereby ordered to repay the $150,000 stolen from the medical trust directly back to the estate of Jeremiah Washington." Vivian gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. "We do not have that money," she cried out, ignoring all courtroom decorum. "We spent it. We are bankrupt. Please, you cannot do this. We have nothing left." "That is a matter for the collection agencies and the criminal courts," Mrs. Washington, Judge Harrison replied without a single ounce of sympathy. "You stole from a dying man to fund a party. You will repay every single cent, even if it means liquidating whatever personal assets you have left. This court is adjourned." The sharp, decisive crack of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. It was over. The battle was completely finished. I stood up from the defense table. Trey wrapped his arms securely around my waist, pulling me close. Elias and Mr. Sterling began packing the legal binders back into their briefcases. The energy at our table was calm, efficient, and victorious. Across the aisle, it was a scene of total devastation. Kiara was hyperventilating, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Desmond was staring blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed by the reality of his impending criminal charges and financial ruin. Connor remained slumped over the table, refusing to lift his head. Vivian slowly stood up. Her legs were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. She looked at me across the short distance separating our tables. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick black streaks. The arrogant, wealthy socialite who had tried to put me on an allowance just a few weeks ago was entirely gone. In her place was a broken, terrified woman facing the absolute destruction of everything she had ever cared about. I did not offer her a triumphant smile. I did not gloat. I did not need to rub salt in the wound because the wound itself was fatal. I simply picked up my designer handbag, turned my back on the people who had thrown me out in the rain 19 years ago, and walked toward the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. They had tried to bury me, but they had only succeeded in giving me the shovel I used to dig their graves. Exactly 30 days later, the sun beat down on the Buckhead neighborhood with sweltering, unforgiving Georgia heat. I sat comfortably in the climate-controlled back seat of my armored SUV parked at a discreet distance under the shade of a massive oak tree. Trey sat beside me, his hand resting warmly over mine. We were watching the final pathetic act of a tragedy my parents had written for themselves. Parked in the circular driveway of the sprawling estate, right where a fleet of luxury sedans used to sit, was a rusted budget rental moving truck. Its faded yellow paint was a glaring, humiliating eyesore against the manicured landscaping. Vivian and Desmond were doing the heavy lifting themselves. Their assets were entirely frozen by the district attorney pending the ongoing criminal fraud investigation, and every remaining cent they had was being forcefully liquidated to repay the estate, the $150,000 they stole. They could not afford to hire a professional moving crew. I watched through the tinted glass as my mother, wearing a stained designer tracksuit, struggled to drag a heavy cardboard box across the pristine cobblestones. Her normally flawless hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat and humidity. Desmond looked completely broken. His shoulders stooped as he shoved a velvet armchair into the back of the dirty truck. There was no sign of Kiara or Connor to help them. I knew from Chloe's network that Connor was currently fighting his own desperate battle against disbarment and impending bankruptcy, while Kiara had moved into a cramped apartment, forced to actually look for entry-level employment for the first time in her life. They were all too busy drowning in their own consequences to throw each other a life preserver. I felt absolutely no pity. I watched Vivian drop a box of expensive china, the fragile plates shattering loudly on the concrete. She sank to her knees right there in the driveway and buried her face in her hands. Desmond did not even go over to comfort her. He just kept walking back into the empty house, staring blankly at the ground. They had spent their entire lives worshipping the illusion of status, sacrificing their own daughter to maintain a glittering facade. Now the facade was completely gone, leaving them with nothing but the crushing reality of their impending criminal trials. Trey squeezed my fingers, gently pulling my attention away from the pathetic scene. The truck engine sputtered to life, coughing a cloud of dark exhaust into the pristine neighborhood air. We watched in absolute silence as the yellow rental truck lumbered down the driveway and turned onto the main road, disappearing from sight. The toxic grip they had held over my family's legacy was officially permanently broken. I signaled David to drive us up to the front doors. Stepping out of the SUV, I walked up the wide stone steps and unlocked the heavy mahogany door. The house was cavernous, echoing with the hollow silence of a vacated space. I walked through the grand foyer, tracing my fingers along the expensive wainscoting. This was the house my grandfather had built with his blood, sweat, and brilliant business acumen. It was meant to be a fortress of generational wealth and security. Instead, my parents had turned it into a monument of greed. As I stood in the massive empty living room where they had hosted so many fake, pretentious society dinners, I realized with absolute certainty that I could never live here. The walls held too many ghosts of my grandfather's isolated final days and my parents' endless manipulation. I did not want to sleep in the rooms where they had plotted their theft. But I was not going to sell it either. I was going to cleanse it. I turned to Trey, who was watching me with that steady, deeply understanding gaze. I am going to tear down everything inside this house, I told him, my voice ringing clearly in the empty space. I am going to rip out the country club vanity and the useless luxury. We are going to build a sanctuary. Over the next 6 months, I poured my wealth and my entire heart into completely transforming the Buckhead estate. I hired the best contractors, architects, and designers in Atlanta, instructing them to strip the mansion down to its bones. We removed the grand ballroom and the opulent entertainment spaces Vivian had prized so highly. In their place, we installed state-of-the-art server rooms, brilliant coding labs with top-tier workstations, and high-security network infrastructure. We converted the massive guest suites into comfortable private dormitories, creating a safe, dignified living space. I did not just remodel a house, I built the Vanguard Innovation Academy. It was a fully funded, comprehensive transitional housing and tech incubator program designed specifically for African American youth who had been kicked out, marginalized, or abandoned by their families. I remembered exactly what it felt like to stand on a porch in the freezing rain at 16 years old, holding a garbage bag full of wet clothes, completely terrified of the future. I knew there were brilliant, capable teenagers out there right now experiencing that exact same terrifying rejection. They did not need pity, they needed a secure roof over their heads, high-speed internet, and someone to teach them how to weaponize their intelligence into a lucrative, untouchable career. I recruited top engineers from my own cybersecurity firm to serve as mentors. We developed a rigorous curriculum focusing on forensic accounting, network defense, ethical hacking, and advanced business management. I ensured the pantry was always fully stocked, the security perimeter was completely ironclad, and the environment was entirely rooted in respect and empowerment. The story of my life did not end in a courtroom or in the back of a moving truck. It culminated on a bright, beautiful Saturday afternoon in early spring during the grand opening of the academy. The estate was completely unrecognizable from the dark, greedy place it used to be. It was vibrant, alive, and buzzing with the electric energy of limitless potential. I stood on the newly expanded front porch, the very architectural symbol of the place where my parents had once discarded me. The warm sun washed over my shoulders. Behind me, the heavy oak doors were thrown wide open, welcoming in a new generation of leaders. The driveway was not filled with the luxury cars of pretentious socialites. It was filled with the laughter and excited chatter of the first cohort of students, brilliant young men and women who were finally being given the resources they deserved. I looked around at the people standing by my side. Trey had his arm wrapped securely around my waist, his presence a constant reminder of what genuine, unconditional love actually looked like. Chloe stood to my left holding a clipboard and enthusiastically debating firewall protocols with a group of wide-eyed teenagers. Mr. Sterling, the estate attorney who had helped execute this master plan, stood near the gardens watching the proceedings with a proud, watery smile. This was my chosen family. They were the people who saw my value when I had nothing, who fought beside me in the trenches, and who celebrated my victories without a single ounce of jealousy or greed. I took a deep breath, letting the sweet, unburdened air fill my lungs. Vivian and Desmond had tried to destroy me. They had looked at a highly intelligent, fiercely independent young girl and decided she was nothing more than a disposable inconvenience. They thought they could throw me away like trash, assuming I would simply disappear into the cracks of the city and be forgotten. They had completely underestimated the fire they ignited the night they locked that door. They only succeeded in teaching me how to survive the harshest conditions, how to see through manipulation, and how to relentlessly build an empire from absolute scratch. I had taken the profound pain of their rejection and forged it into an unbreakable suit of armor. I looked at a young woman standing near the coding lab, a 17-year-old girl who had arrived yesterday with her belongings in a backpack, her eyes full of the same fierce, guarded determination I used to have. I smiled at her and she smiled back, her posture relaxing just a fraction. I had broken the cycle of abuse and replaced it with a fortress of opportunity. My grandfather's wealth was finally being used exactly as he would have wanted, empowering the next generation to build their own untouchable legacies. I stood on the porch of my empire surrounded by the family I chose and the future I was actively shaping. My heart was completely whole. My boundaries were absolute and unbreakable. I had fought the hardest battle of my life, and I had emerged with the greatest prize of all: absolute, unapologetic, and magnificent peace.